Alright, let me share with you my current DJI Pocket 3 D-Log M Pro color grading workflow in Davinci Resolve. However, before I start, I do want to mention that I'm going to use a lot of expensive DCTL plugins in this video because they do make my life much easier. I got most of them for free, so if you are not interested in that, maybe you should watch another video. But I will say this though, you will still be able to somewhat replicate the results I am going to show you in this video with the native tools of Resolve. It will be just a bit more tedious and time consuming. Also, because for the most part I am going to use DCTL plugins from PixelTools because I've been collaborating with them for quite a bit now. I do want to mention that currently they have like a huge sale going on their website for the DCTL plugins and power grades. So if you are interested, check out the link down below. That said, let's start. So here is the shot I'm going to be grading today. I shot this also with the Freewheel 1.1x anamorphic lens. Maybe right in here you'll be able to see the flare it produces. And now in terms of my project settings, I'm using Davinci with Gamut Intermediate for the timeline color space. And then for the output color space, I'm using Rec 709 Type A because I'm grading on a MacBook display. Now let me apply my costume power grade or node 3 for the Pocket 3 and then go node by node, explain to you exactly what each node does. So I'm gonna go in here, power grades, Pocket 3, apply this, close everything. And now let's get through the basics first. IDT and then ODT, or in my case DRT. The IDT basically takes me from D-Log M to Davinci with Gamut Intermediate with these free custom DCTL. Link is going to be down below. And then for the ODT, or in this case DRT, I'm using a free DRT from JP2499, and it takes me from Davinci with Gamut Intermediate to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 because currently in the display settings my profile is set to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. So I think I'm gonna start with the look first and then work basically underneath the look because it's a bit easier from my experience at least. And to do that, I'm going to start with this print node and also this negative node, which is where I add a print stock and then also a negative stock. And these two nodes are from the PixelTools Film Emulsion plugin. I've made a whole video about this. You can watch it right here. So let me select this print node in here and basically select the print stock I want. This is 2383, 2993 and 3510. I think I'm going to leave it to the default settings and just slightly reduce the intensity as well, like 75. And I'm gonna switch to the negative DCTL in here, also from PixelTools. It is split into 3 different DCTLs, one for Fuji, one for Kodak, and one for mixed, but the Kodak one is my favorite. Let me just cycle through the negative stocks in here to see which one looks the best. This one is nice, too warm, too blue, too warm, too saturated. It's either this one or the 50D. 50D looks better. Let me just reduce the intensity a bit. And then also I'm going to adjust the white balance just slightly, minus 0.2. And then maybe, let me just see how it looks like. Maybe reduce the magenta tint, probably from the ND filters I've used in here. Just gonna add a bit more green, 0.1 should work just fine. All right, next I'm going to adjust the blacks basically because by default, as you can see, this plugin produces a pretty faded look, which is one of my biggest complaints about this plugin. So I'm using this black node in here with the custom curves. I basically added a point at the blacks, just pushing it to the right to add a bit more contrast basically to the blacks. And usually I like having my blacks at about 4 IRE, basically my shadows, and then the highlights at 75 IRE. If I'm going to zoom in on my waveform, you'll be able to see this reference point in here. So usually I don't like going below this with my blacks. So let me play with this point in here. Like, let's say this is way too much. I'm like losing information in the blacks. I want to keep some of the information, but I don't want to make it look too faded at the same time. Maybe something like this. This is the before and after, before and after. Huge difference in my opinion. All right, now I'm going to adjust the contrast and also the density. For the contrast, I'm using the iridescent color filmic tone curve DCTL, which I bought myself actually. It was about 30 bucks, I believe. And basically it behaves the same way the curve in here behaves, but it by default locks the middle gray point for you for the specific color space you're going to use. And also it's a bit easier to use with these sliders. Let me just show you the curve. You can like, you know, add a bit more contrast basically. I'm gonna just set it in here. And then you can adjust the pivot, basically the middle gray if you want to. I'm not going to do that. You can play around with the whites if you want to. And then you can also play with the blacks if you wanna have them more faded. I'm gonna actually push it a bit down to like 0.04. And then you can play with these sliders in here to create like a nice roll off from the midtones and shadows and highlights. Just play with this, make it a bit smoother if you will. This is a bit more refined. This is for the shadows. And then with these sliders, you can add saturation to the midtones, highlights, or the shadows. Let me just zoom in, show you how it works. I'm gonna use the midtones in here. No saturation, more saturation. It's very refined as you can see. So if you want to reduce saturation in a specific exposure area of the frame, you can just use the slider in here and reduce it. But I am going to turn it off because I can use other tools to do this a bit better. And now in terms of the density, I am going to use another DCTL plugin from PixelTools, the Hue Shift Density DCTL. And by default in here, I've set the global density to 0.1 before and after, before and after. It's a bit too strong. Let me go like 0.075 and now let's do it before and after, before and after. Let me just show you how it looks like on the extreme end. So basically, you know, reduces the exposure on the colors of the frame and makes them a bit more dense. And if you go to the left, it's going to brighten up the exposure on the colors, but I am going to set it to 0.075. Then also in here, you can target specific colors in the frame, like the yellows, which I am going to slightly adjust, but not too much because this is D-Log-M, not so flexible. Also the cyans in here, I want to play around with them. The greens also maybe. The reds I'm not really going to touch because it's going to affect my skin tones. I can use another node for that. And I think that's it. Before and after, before and after. Actually, it's a bit too strong with the yellows. Let me just reduce it to like 0.075. And then let's do it before and after, before and after. All right, now I'm going to do a basic adjustment in terms of like exposure, white balance, saturation, and contrast. And I'm going to use this balance node in here for that. And I'm using another DCTL to do all of these. This is the PixelTools Prime Grade DCTL. And it basically puts all the necessary tools to do a basic color correction in one, like exposure, contrast, white balance, and saturation. And at the same time, it gives you like checker tools in here, like false colors, and then white balance checkers, skin checkers as well. Somewhere around here you can check the skin tones. You can also change the modes for each adjustment. For example, if you want to use linear gain, or offset for the exposure, you can change it in here. For example, also with the balance, I personally prefer to adjust the white balance with the linear gain because the results are a bit more photometric, more photo accurate, if you will. So you can change directly in here. And at the same time, you can work in pretty much any color space you want, but I'm gonna set it to Davinci Intermediate, and I have the same DCTL at the end of my node tree after the DRT, basically in the Rex 109 Gamma 2.4 color space. And the reason I'm using it in here because I prefer to, you know, use the checker tools in a Gamma 2.4 color space. And all I've done in here is basically I set the transfer function to Gamma 2.4, and I've enabled the false colors to basically judge exposure when it comes to skin tones at least. And usually I like having the brightest parts of the skin with this kind of a color, this brownish orange color, if you will. So let me just set it to somewhere around here, I would say. This is a bit too dark, so I'm gonna come back to the balance node, go to the exposure slider in here, and slightly bring it up to something like this. Let's go minus 0.7. Let me disable this. Now it's a bit, you know, better exposed, if you will. Next, I'm going to play with this flare slider in here, which adds a bit more bite to the shadows, if you will, but not too much. like this. The fill slider also does the same thing pretty much, but it is a bit more refined than the flare slider. But actually with this one, I'm gonna go a bit higher, right? And then I'm gonna go to the left with the flare one. Something like so. Then with the speculars, you can basically reduce or increase the exposure on the brightest parts of the frame. You can enable this highlight speculars overlay. It's gonna show you what you are affecting. And then with the range slider in here, you can affect the range and basically either, you know, compress the information, I mean the highlights, or, you know, increase the exposure basically. I'm gonna slightly compress it about here. Should work just fine. Let me just zoom in a bit more so you can see what I'm doing. So here is how it was before, and I'm just gonna put it somewhere around here, something like this. Now let me adjust the temperature, the white balance basically, something like this, and then maybe add a touch of green, something like this. Now the white balance is a bit more correct. Now let's play with the saturation. I'm using subtractive saturation, by the way. You can change the mode in here if you want to. Yeah, I think something like this should work just fine. And then here you can adjust the contrast. It's gonna lock the middle gray point for you automatically, depending on the color space you're using in here. Just gonna set it to like 1.04. The pivot is to adjust the middle gray point. This one, I'm not really sure what this one does, honestly. And then this one as well, I'm not really sure what it does. Here is a before and after, before and after, a huge difference in my opinion. All right, next I'm going to play around with the skin tones. First of all, in here I have this skin soft node, which is usually where I add a mid-tone detail. I push it to the left just to soften the skin tones a little bit. Let me do a before and after for you. Here is a before and after, before and after. As you can see, it reduces the digital edge a little bit. And all I'm doing in here is I basically added a qualification of the skin, and again I'm just pushing the mid-tone detail here to the left to -20 basically. And also the skin in here looks a bit too red to me, so I'm gonna use the skin hue node to adjust the skin tones. Again, I have the same qualification for the skin, and then to adjust the skin tones I am going to use the Hue Shift DCTL from PixelTools. There is like a skin section in here. I can just adjust the hue, something like this. Looks a bit more natural. Reduce the saturation a bit, and then maybe increase the density just slightly, something like so. I'm just eyeballing it, honestly. This is before and after, before and after. Let me zoom in a bit more. Before and after, before and after. And now I can play around with this node in here, which is where I adjust specific hues in the frame. Again, I'm using the PixelTools Hue Shift DCTL for that. So maybe I can play with the cyans in here. Let me see. Adjust the color of the cyan. Maybe reduce the saturation slightly. Let's see what else. The greens. I'm definitely going to play around with the greens here. Make the green a bit more bluey in a way. Maybe reduce the saturation as well, just a little bit. And then the blues, maybe slightly change it up here. And then let's play with the yellows. This is more warm, more blue. Let's warm up the yellows a little bit, just something like so. And honestly, I think this is enough. Before and after, before and after. A very minor tweak. You'll mostly see the difference in here. Before and after, before and after. I'm actually going to come back to my skin hue node in here and reduce the saturation a bit further with the, with the saturation slider in here for the skin tones. Let me see how bleach bypass is gonna look on this shot. I have this bleach bypass node in here for that, just in case if I want to add it. And I'm basically using the film creator in here with the bleach bypass slider set to 0.2. Here is a before and after, before and after. Actually, I kind of like this, but it's a bit too strong. Let me just show you how it looks at 100% intensity. As you can see, it has this contrasty black and white effect, if you will. But I'm gonna set it to like 0.125. Here is a before and after, before and after. I always have this node just in case if I want to add this effect, because sometimes, like in this case, it looks great. Right now I'm going to create like a split tone effect between the shadows and highlights by basically injecting a certain color in the shadows and then usually a complementary color in the highlights. I think I'm gonna go for a classic teal and orange look, if you will. And I'm using another DCTL plugin from PixelTools, which I've made a whole video about. You can watch it right here. This is the split tone RGB DCTL from PixelTools, and it allows me to accurately inject any color I want basically in any exposure area of the frame. So let me show you how quickly it works actually. I'm gonna enable this curve in here. Let me just enable the node, and then I'm gonna set the shadows to -50 to put in teal, balance it out in here, and then I'm gonna set this to like -20 and then -5, something like this. Actually, it's a bit too strong, -15. And now I'm going to set this to like -50 to add a bit more warmth to the high midtones. And then I'm going to set this to about 30. So now I'm going to play with these highlights in here, like -30, and then add a bit more green to make the yellow a bit more golden, and add a bit more red at the same time. And that's basically it. Let me just zoom in to somewhere around here, do a before and after, before and after. And what I like about this is that it basically locks the middle gray point for you by default, depending on the color space you choose in here. And also, if you want to clean up the middle gray point, you can use this neutral pivot slider in here and basically remove the colors from the middle gray. And you can do the same thing for the blacks. Look at this part of the frame. You'll be able to like remove the color from the shadows. And then the same thing basically for the whites. Maybe if I am going to go in here and clean the whites, you'll be able to see that the whites become a bit more white. But I'm going to use the default settings. And also at the same time, you can reduce the intensity, which I'm going to do definitely because it's a bit too strong for me. I'm gonna set it to somewhere around here. Let's go like 40. And now let's do before and after, before and after. As you can see, it adds this beautiful teal color into the shadows. Right? And then also if I'm gonna go to the t-shirt here of my model, it adds a bit of a warm vibe, which creates this beautiful, you know, split tone effect between highlights and shadows. All right, finally, I am going to enable this vignetting node in here. I'm using in here just a simple power window, basically. It's like a circular power window. I've inverted the selection in here, and then I'm just going like to -0.04 with the gamma to reduce the exposure and create basically a vignette. It's a bit too strong for me. I'm gonna set it to somewhere around here, and here is a before and after, before and after. As you can see, it adds a bit of a vignette around the frame. And also, just to make it a bit more nostalgic and kinda old, if you will, I'm going to use this grain node in here to add grain, halation, and bloom. And in here, I am using Dehancer because unfortunately, as of now, PixelTools don't have like a custom DCTL for halation, bloom, and grain. So let me just zoom in here, and already by default, it has this beautiful grain, a bit of halation, and also blooming effect. Let me just adjust everything in here. I'm gonna set the grain to like 60 millimeters, ISO 50, and this one as well. Enable this, and let me just look at the highlights here, play with the slider. Let's look at the skin. Sometimes the halation can affect the skin tones in a negative way. I'm gonna set it somewhere around here, and then the bloom, let me just increase it like 60 millimeters as well. Check out how it looks before and after, before and after. I definitely like this. And let me maybe also play with the intensity in here. This is nothing applied. This is 100%. A bit too strong for me, if you ask me, but it definitely adds this, you know, nostalgic vibe, if you will. Let's set it to like 35. I think it's going to be more than enough for me. And by the way, if you are using Dehancer, I would highly recommend setting the quality in here to high to get better results, basically. All right, so let's recap exactly what I've done to this shot in this video. First of all, I converted D-Log to Davinci with gamut intermediate with a custom DCTL. Then I used the JP2409 DRT to bring me back to Rex 109 Gamma 2.4. Then I added a look with print, negative, and the blacks basically with film emulsion by PixelTools. Then I played with the contrast in here to add a bit more bite to the shot. Then added a bit more density with the Hue Shift PixelTools DCTL. Then I adjusted the exposure, white balance, contrast, and saturation with this balance node in here. Then I played with the skin soft node in here to slightly remove the sharpness from the skin tones. Then adjusted the skin tones in here to make them a bit more accurate. Then I played with certain colors in the frame with this hue adjustment and the PixelTools Hue Shift DCTL in here. Then I added a bit of a vignette to the frame. And then I added a bit of a bleach bypass effect with Film Creator bleach bypass. And then I added a cool color split tone effect with this split node in here. I used the PixelTools Split Tone Pro DCTL for that. And finally, just to soften everything up, I used Dehancer to add grain, halation, and bloom to make it a bit more filmic, if you will. Here is a before and after, before and after. Let me zoom out, and here is a before and after, before and after. If you ask me, this is a huge difference. All right, so hopefully I found this video to be informative and useful. Hopefully you learned maybe something new today. I know I used a lot of expensive DCTL plugins in this video, but honestly they do make a huge difference in my color grading workflow, and because of them I was able to step up my color grading results. Basically, I'm not recommending buying these DCTLs if you are a beginner, definitely not. You can still achieve most of these results with the native tools of Resolve if you are going to learn how to use them properly, but the DCTLs definitely make life much easier. If you are interested to buy any of these DCTLs from PixelTools, check out the link down below. Thank you everybody for watching, and I guess I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.